Rachel had always loved the winter. The crisp air, the snow blanketing the world in silence, and the feeling of isolation that came with being surrounded by nothing but endless white. But this winter was different. She had rented a small, secluded cabin deep in the mountains for a week of solitude. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of her hectic life. However, something felt off from the moment she arrived. The road to the cabin was barely visible beneath the thick snow. It felt as though nature itself was trying to keep her out. The snowstorm began as soon as she parked her car and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind howled in the distance, growing louder as she made her way to the cabin. The sky had turned an ominous gray, and snowflakes fell in a relentless, heavy downpour. She tried to shake off the unsettling feeling in her gut as she turned the key in the lock and stepped inside. The cabin was old but cozy, its wooden walls creaking under the weight of the storm outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Rachel sighed with relief as she unpacked her things. The isolation she had sought now seemed a little more menacing, but she shrugged it off. She was alone, and that was the whole point. Yet, as the evening progressed, she began to feel a strange unease. The wind outside had grown deafening, almost as though it were trying to tell her something. Nightfall descended, and the house grew eerily quiet. But just as she began to relax, a soft knock echoed through the cabin, coming from the window. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. She cautiously approached the window, but when she looked out, all she saw was an endless blanket of snow. No footprints, no sign of movement. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind. But then, the knocking came again, this time at the door. She hesitated, wondering if perhaps someone had lost their way in the storm. She opened the door slowly, peering into the darkness. No one was there. Nothing but the swirling snow and the howling wind. A chill ran down her spine as she closed the door, bolting it shut. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. As the night dragged on, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. The fire in the hearth flickered, struggling to stay alive in the cold. Rachel wrapped herself in blankets, trying to ignore the creeping dread that had taken hold of her. But then, just as she thought she might fall asleep, she heard it again, the faint knock. This time, it was coming from inside the house. Her heart raced as she stood up, her eyes darting around the room. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The knocking continued, growing louder with each passing second. She approached the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the old wooden walls. The walls groaned under the pressure, as though something, or someone, was trapped inside. Her breath caught in her throat when she noticed a shadow pass across the wall, moving against the light of the fire. Rachel rushed to the door, her mind racing with terror. She needed to leave. She had to get out of there. But when she opened the door to the storm outside, she was met with a wall of snow. The blizzard had intensified, and she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of her. She ran through the house, searching for any sign of escape, but the shadow followed her, always just out of sight. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, as though the house itself was alive, breathing with an unnatural rhythm. When Rachel finally managed to step outside, the cold hit her like 1,000 needles. But she wasn't alone. There, standing just outside the cabin, was a figure. Tall, thin, with hollow eyes and an expression twisted in eternal torment. The figure stepped toward her, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. She turned to run, but her legs felt heavy, as though the snow was pulling her back. The wind howled louder, drowning out her screams as the figure reached out and, everything went dark. David and Mark had been hunting in the northern woods for years. They knew the forest like the back of their hands, having spent countless winters there, tracking deer and other wildlife. But this year, something felt different. The weather had turned bitterly cold, colder than it should have been for late December. The snow came down heavily, blanketing the forest in a thick layer that made everything seem unnaturally quiet. The two friends arrived at their usual campsite, a small clearing near a river. It was a place they had visited every year, and yet this time, the air felt different. There was an unsettling stillness in the forest. No birds, no animals, not even the usual rustling of leaves. Just an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. That night, as they sat around the campfire, the wind began to pick up. The trees creaked and groaned in the distance, but the silence returned quickly after. It wasn't natural, and it sent a chill through both men. David suggested they go to sleep and start their hunt at first light, but Mark wasn't so sure. He kept feeling like someone, or something, was watching them. The next morning, they set out deep into the woods. But as they walked, something felt wrong. The trail was empty, no signs of animals, no footprints, no tracks in the snow. Mark was uneasy, but David insisted they push on. They were hunters, this was what they did. Hours later, they found themselves in an unfamiliar part of the forest, far from their usual hunting grounds. The trees were thick, the snow almost blinding in its whiteness. That's when Mark saw it, a figure standing in the distance. A tall, gaunt man with pale skin and hollow eyes, staring directly at them. David saw it too. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, but as they approached, the figure didn't move. It was as though it wasn't real, just a shadow frozen in time. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. He reached for his rifle, but as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the figure disappeared into the snow. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. David nodded, but his face had gone pale. Something was wrong. They weren't alone. They quickly turned to leave, but the forest had changed. The path they had walked was gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and shadows. The snowstorm had worsened, and the air seemed to grow colder with each step. Then, just as they turned a corner, the figure appeared again, this time much closer. Mark froze in place. The figure's eyes were hollow, empty, staring right through him. It took a step forward, its foot sinking into the snow without a sound. Mark tried to shout, but no words came out. The figure's hand shot forward, grabbing him by the arm with inhuman strength. David tried to fire his rifle, but it misfired. In the blink of an eye, Mark was gone. Vanished into the snowstorm, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. David searched desperately, but there was nothing. No sign of Mark, no trail, not even a footprint. The figure was gone, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. David returned to camp, but by the time he arrived, it was already too late. The wind howled again, and he felt the same cold eyes watching him from the trees. There would be no escape from this place. Janet had always been drawn to winter. There was something about the cold, the solitude, and the endless blanket of snow that made her feel alive. So when she found an old cabin by a frozen lake, deep in the woods, she jumped at the opportunity to rent it for the holidays. The caretaker was an old man, with a strange look in his eyes. When she asked about the cabin, he hesitated before warning her, "Don't go outside after dark. And never, ever open the cellar door." Janet dismissed it as superstition, just a local's fear of the unknown. After all, this was just a cabin, not some haunted house. She arrived late in the afternoon, and by the time the sun set, the cabin was blanketed in snow. The air was crisp, and the wind howled through the trees. Janet felt at home, at peace, far from the noise of her city life. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling outside the cabin like a wolf's cry. She bundled up in blankets next to the fire, reading a book to pass the time. But as the hours passed, she began to hear strange noises, scratching sounds coming from behind the walls. At first, she thought it was the wind or perhaps some animal outside. But the sound grew louder and more insistent. It sounded almost like whispering. Janet got up and walked toward the cellar door. Her hand hovered over the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing only darkness beyond. The air was frigid, the smell of damp wood and earth filling her nostrils. She stepped inside, her feet crunching on the cold dirt floor. At first, she didn't notice them, lying motionless in the far corner of the cellar. When her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw the frozen bodies of people. Their faces were contorted in terror, their eyes wide open, as though they had died in agony. She gasped, stepping backward, only to trip over a body, and as she fell, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a figure, still alive, moving slowly beneath the ice, trapped. The temperature dropped even further. The wind howled outside, and the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. She spun around, but the cellar was empty now, save for the bodies of the frozen dead. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her ears. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. When she turned, there was nothing there, but the temperature continued to plummet. The whispers surrounded her, louder and clearer now. "You shouldn't have come." As the final story concludes, the listener is left with the chilling realization that these are not just tales, they are warnings. Winter is not a time for isolation. Not every place is meant to be explored. And sometimes, the coldest nights hide the darkest secrets. The figures in the snow, the bodies trapped beneath the ice, the voices in the wind, these things are real, and they are out there.